This is the Kea Research podcast. Our podcast helps to bring you analyst insights from sages within the industry and from analyst relations leaders. Here's your host, Duncan Chapple, researcher and managing partner at Kea Research.
Tim Miller, thank you so much for joining us today. So, Tim, in your more than 14 years working at 451, you've continued the work that you started at Web Mergers of tracking the M&A market, the advisory firms that are working in technology markets, and in the in 451's M&A KnowledgeBase, you've developed over these years an incredibly strong resource for organizations that want to better understand the key private IT transactions that are unfolding in the industry. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you today.
Thank you, Duncan.
So, Tim, let's start at the high level. I mean, is there a big change in the way that people are talking about mergers and acquisitions and investments right now? Are people looking at it more strategically, more tactically? Is there a lot of continuity? What is going on in tech M&A?
It's a great question, and what I think has happened is that we've reached a period of capitulation, particularly by vendors, but also by end users. Capitulation to the idea that organic growth itself is not going to be enough. Now, we've always known that, I suppose, but now I think that we're seeing it in a much more real way. It's not enough impossible to develop organically in order to keep up with the really accelerating innovation that we're seeing in the tech world. I compare it to a vortex, and maybe it's not the right image, but it's the one that resonates with me. This constant swirling faster and faster world of tech innovation and disruption coming faster and faster. It's a cyclone, the path of which is really difficult to predict. And we're just seeing more and more vendors, large and small, as well as their investment groups, come into us, for data that helps them understand valuations for sure, but also what's going on competitively. What are their competitors buying, given that the lens to a company's strategy is probably no more clearly demonstrated than in its M&A activity. And also they're looking at market intelligence, like where's the hot money going in the industry. So I do think there's a period of capitulation, if you know what I mean by that.
And so
I think
yeah.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Your vision of the vortex reminds me of Geoffrey Moore's notion of being inside the tornado. That there are solutions that develop, they're aimed at early adopters, they succeed with the early adopters, they're able to cross over into the mainstream market. They think that they've won safety, but actually immediately they're in a much harder, much competitive market. And I think maybe there's something there which makes M&A beneficial not just for the acquirer that gets this new strategic direction, but also for the firm that's being acquired, that somehow it gets different kinds of expertise. So in a certain sense, is it something like a double capitulation? The firm that's being sold admits that it can't grow without the support of a larger partner, and also the larger partner admits that in a way what it has to offer the world isn't its own ingenuity, but its ability to take solutions to market.
It's interesting, a double capitulation. And I think for many startup companies, given the IPO market being as sickly as it is, of course there's this whole world of unicorns that just keep raising round after round after round. That's going to end soon. But I think many companies just understand on the private side that there's not going to be a big IPO event, and maybe that's not even so desirable, and that their liquidity event of choice is actually to get acquired. And I think that's it's arguably more accepted now than it used to be. I think one thing we're seeing from the acquirers, particularly the vendors, is because this vortex is swirling so quickly, right? And they need to look further and further and further ahead to see what's coming. Some of the companies I've been speaking with have gone from looking at, the startup community, actually looking at very, very, very early stage companies. And that gets into the request for data and the data-driven aspect of this, which we can talk about in a little bit. But I see, getting further ahead down the road because, again, it's almost too late if you already know the companies that are pretty well known in the industry. There's another point here that's interesting to me, and that is the way this vortex is affecting end user companies, big end users of technology that are not necessarily in the tech industry. I mean, we're seeing that in a couple of ways. Number one, how can they leverage, innovation and new technology for competitive advantage, right? We always used to traditionally think, oh, it's the financial services firms that can see this direct relationship between a new technology and the ability to make money, do faster trades, or get insight on trades and so on. But now we're seeing this flow out into other companies as well. We're seeing more and more non-tech companies buying into technology, as everyone knows, but that's becoming, essentially, GE, General Electric is probably a great example of that. But it's almost, you could argue that every company is becoming a technology company, buying whatever it is in the technology world that accelerates their own product development. We're seeing, drug companies, not only looking at their own acquisitions, but now looking at our data to see what their competitors are doing and what their competitors are buying in the technology world. That's how far along it's gone, that they can't even keep up with what their competitors are buying in the IT technology world. I'm not talking about drug, pharmaceutical companies. So that's kind of interesting. And then, of course, the market intelligence aspect as well. They're looking at where the puck is going and who is investing in what hot sectors.
And when you look at organizations that are maybe putting themselves in a position of investors, do you see different pressures on them, different things that are driving their buying habits? I mean, I can think of some of the organizations that I've spoken to. Some of them very much are driven in a very strategic way, are driven by market intelligence. There are other organizations, especially maybe these very large end user organizations, which are starting to see the opportunities from digital transformation and from big data to create their own entrepreneurial technology solutions and to take those into the market. There's also a degree of opportunism there. Do you see, do you see these different drivers pushing different kinds of M&A strategies? Or at the more strategic level, is it becoming more and more driven by market intelligence?
Well, I think this gets to the data aspect of it, of M&A. And let me clarify your question. Is that what you're asking? Is the process becoming more data-driven now?
Yeah, I suppose what I suspect is that there might be two different sets of buyers who might be acting very differently in the M&A market. There might be organizations that are really approaching the market like investors, I suppose, like investors that are looking for businesses that are going to be synergistic or that they can take to market. And I think they will have more of a strategic, data-driven, intelligence-driven approach towards their investments. But on the other hand, I can imagine, for example, a large insurance company or some large organization that somehow is identifying particular opportunities for it to develop new commercial solutions itself. It might be looking to make more tactical acquisitions, which enable it to take to market projects that it's already working on, rather than taking a more strategic, a more neutral view?
Oh, that's interesting, and I think that latter sort of internal incubator thing. I can think of, certainly, I'm naming one hand a number of products that have been brought commercially to the market, and I think that could be the next wave, where that's not quite here yet, where companies that have identified something in-house that really gives competitive advantage decide to take that on the road. And it could be a whole new world for investment bankers, for funders, and also for analyst firms like ourselves to help people do those kind of spin-outs, I guess you might call them, or carve-outs.
And so what is the state of the M&A market now? I mean, is there a kind of seasonality? I mean, I get the feeling that in a way, as you've indicated, there's a surprisingly weak M&A market, despite there being quite low interest rates. And you'd imagine that the market could be more dynamic given the low interest rates that we have. But on the other hand, there seem to be some firms which have already been successful in getting earlier rounds of funding and are pushing forward quite dramatically in being able to get further tranches of funding.
Exactly. That funding party might be a little bit winding down now, and I think it's pretty clear that it is. And so I do see that this year so far, M&A spending has been down substantially from the last two blockbuster years we've had. In 2015, 2016 have been incredible record-setting years in tech M&A. But I see it more as a blip driven by sort of some uncertainty on the macroeconomic side of things, just increasing nationalism around the world, and maybe some of those fears are being allayed. Questions about the Trump administration and its tax policies and its trade policies. I have absolutely no doubt this is going to come roaring back when we get a little bit of more stability in our macroeconomic world. So I don't, people quibble whether there is an M&A cycle or an M&A season. I see it more as a steady flow that's going to be here with us for forever.
And I guess it's the thing that industry analysts pray for every year is just more uncertainty, and there's no shortage of that for you and for your clients.
I worked at Ziff Davis many years ago, and I remember Bill Ziff was talking about obsolescence of the PC industry, which was driving a lot of our business back then, and he said obsolescence is our friend, because it just kept driving more need for more computer reviews and so on that made these 2-inch thick issues of PC Magazine at the time. So yeah, I guess it's our friend.
So I mean, we've spoken a lot about the growing reliance of M&A managers and executives on having the right intelligence and trying to move towards a more data-driven approach, partly because of the greater complexity, the greater demands, the greater caution that investors have in putting money into tech markets. I know that with tools like your M&A Outlook report, for example, you're producing, a huge, extensive playbook for the state of the M&A market in 2017. What should we be expecting? I mean, what are the key trends that you're expecting people to gear their M&A strategies around right now?
Exactly. Well, and what this report does, it just talks about drivers, that first and foremost. What are the drivers within big sectors, application software, security, et cetera? But then what are the micro drivers within those? And of course, the big themes that you can expect are coming through, but there are a lot of micro themes as well, like mini microclimates, if you will, that are driving M&A. But the big themes, adoption, very, very rapid adoption of cloud, and accelerating adoption of cloud, obviously security, Internet of Things, really driving a lot of strategies out there, machine learning and artificial intelligence. And then within each of these, there are little sub-pools of factors that are driving driving M&A. So that's the one thing that we look at in this report, which is about 100 pages. And then we literally take that then to the specifics. Okay, here we name about 250 companies that we think are going to be acquisition targets. And for many of those, we name a specific acquirer that we think would be a logical acquirer. And we're quite often right. Not always. Sometimes we're not right. Sometimes there's like a total surprise. Like, where did they come from? And then we also highlight, companies. We've now identified about 80 enterprise technology private companies that we believe are IPO prospects within this. So it's just a good guide to what we see coming down the pike in the M&A world. You ask a question there. Well, maybe embedded in this question, but maybe you could expand on it, is the data-driven aspect of this, because I do want to talk to that. That's an extremely interesting question.
Yeah, I think
maybe I'll let you.
Well, one of the things that we often see in pitches where technology companies are pitching to potential investors is to see that investors traditionally have had to weigh up multiple factors. Absolutely, they're looking at what the business has accomplished so far in its early stages. But very often investors also think that they're primarily buying a management team, or maybe they might see that the management team is the big obstacle, and they need to throw it out of the way. And sometimes it's neither the management team nor the technology, but it's the early client relationships, the mind share, the intellectual property that's being evaluated. So very often the process of identifying organizations to be M&A targets or to be potential investors has been quite a connoisseurial activity, I suppose. Something which has taken a lot of expertise. And I think that now, partly because of the greater availability of data, but also because of the more challenging and the more conservative market that we're in, we're seeing investors having to justify their decisions a little bit more. In M&A organizations, general partners and limited partners are having rather different kinds of conversations because of the more challenging times that we are in. And so I think data is being used differently to evaluate M&A partners, both the buyers identifying the sellers and the sellers identifying the best buyers, but also inside investment organizations. I think people are using data differently to justify their decisions. Do you see any evidence of that in the conversations that you're having, or the kinds of demands that you have for your service to evolve?
Absolutely. And you put your finger on something there that's part of the story, which is the greater availability of data, and in addition to the increased need to minimize risks, right? But it's not only the greater availability of data, but the greater availability of tools and the less expensive, the lower cost of tools and the higher power of tools that can analyze this data, whether they're unstructured databases or just data analysis tools. So that's providing the wherewithal to do this. But then the driver is what we talked about earlier, right? This need to get ahead of the game, to find things your competitors are not finding, to get earlier on in the cycle. So here's a good example. I've been talking to a vendor in the network space that they're not a huge company. There are huge companies that are doing a lot of incredible work here as well, but this is a mid-sized company, and they're using tons of historical data, not just to find companies that are being incubated, but trying to find investors that have made wise, savvy picks early on in the past, that have a pattern of making the right picks. So they're not even looking at an existing startup. They're trying to predict where the next startup is going to come from. So talk about being early in the process. The seed has not even been sprouted yet, and they're trying to identify those investors that have the best track records. Again, looking at reams and reams and reams of historical data. I mean, that's just really kind of mind-blowing, but it just illustrates the strategic imperative to get ahead of the game here, ahead of your competitors.
And do you get a sense that there have been changes in the tempo and in the, how can I put it, in the pace of M&A and in the extensiveness of analysis that companies are engaging in? That means that, again, they might need different sorts of information from what they needed 5 or 10 years ago.
We're certainly seeing a lot of attention being paid to private companies and analyzing those companies. So we have other clients that are licensing our data that are using, again, these cheaper tools we're talking about and more available tools to suck in multiple, I mean, dozens of sources and assembling kind of on the fly deep and rich profiles of private companies. And I think that's addressing your question. I think there is absolutely more attention being paid to getting as many sources. And the problem of private company information is not going away. There are dozens and dozens of companies trying to address this with private company databases. The way we've been addressing it mostly is, of course, our analysis, and we're one of the few that provides analysis on many of these smaller companies that are below the radar of most big IT research firms. But in the M&A world, where we're trying to provide visibility, is providing proprietary estimates of the deal value or trailing revenue for key transactions. So for in areas like information security or infrastructure management, I mean, literally 80% of the comparables that are in the database, which would be a multiple of trailing revenue, 80% of those are proprietary to us just because we have some estimates there of some of the key deals. It's not so much a tribute to us getting that many estimates. It's basically a sad fact that there are so few comps available as it is. So yes, I do see a lot of attention being paid to more rigorous analysis with sort of massive data sets.
Tim, a question occurs to me that is a bit out of left field, and you absolutely may not have an answer for it, so feel free to skip it. But the question runs something like this. Tim, when you're looking at these private companies, some of them are going to be quite guarded, and some of them will be more open. And you and your team will have become absolute experts in getting information about organizations that think that they can keep their affairs a little bit more private than is realistically that is a realistic expectation. But do you have some thoughts about what the implications are of the choices that private firms make about maintaining information asymmetry? I mean, I think on the one hand, a lot of private firms really struggle to keep information private. But on the other hand, organizations typically are going to have a higher valuation if they're more open about information. Even if it's not good news, simply the fact that you know what's inside the box makes investors a little bit more comfortable. Have you had any, I don't know, have you had any thoughts about what these different choices about organizations' transparency, what do those differences in transparency mean for investors or for the valuations that those companies actually realize when they come through to sale?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think a lot of the times folks are not transparent about their revenue or their growth is when it's not great, right? Because the minute a product line has 400% growth, a company is very willing to spout that out in a press release, right? But I'm going to go out on a limb and make my next prediction. And my prediction is that we're going to see another capitulation. First one was by acquirers that they can't do things all organically. Second capitulation, I think, could happen on the private company side where they finally come to the realization that transparency is going to be the way to go. just because so much information is leaking out, and it's partial information and often inaccurate and not interpreted. Why wouldn't they want real information to get out by organizations like ours and other research firms that could actually give some context to it, not put it out in a vacuum, but put it out with someone who can give some context to that growth. So that's maybe just wishful thinking, Duncan, but I would love to see companies becoming more transparent. In the meantime, we're having to kind of do that on our own and provide some reasonable and vetted estimates to our clients, because it's a black hole that we're trying to help people fill.
Now, of course, it's a trend in many markets, not only in tech markets, that investors are looking for help to fill the gap between what a company's management is prepared to make public and what can be obtained through the best efforts of researchers. And in a way, that gap in itself, the more it can be filled, the more it drives value. One of the nicest examples I've seen, though it's not a tech example, is from the business school at Tulane University down in New Orleans. They have a project there called the Birkenroad Reports, where they get their business school students to research companies down there in Louisiana that are already public, but about which there's very little research. And they use publicly available information to write reports about these firms which are already public, so there should be less information asymmetry. But even the fact that a group of business school students are writing reports that kind of tell a story about these firms has a really profound impact on the valuation of these organizations. So, you know, a small amount of effort put in to researching firms can produce a huge transformation in the information available to investors, and thus their confidence in putting money into firms. Do you have any sense of that happening with your customers, that the way in which you're able to fill that gap is allowing them maybe to make bigger bets in the market or to make faster decisions? What kind of impact do you see it making in the way that they are making their choices?
Yeah, no, I see it as sort of a mosaic, right? We're not going to be able to help someone fill all the pieces and the tiles in that mosaic, but we can certainly provide some of them, and that's our mission, right? And they're going elsewhere and doing their own research to provide other pieces. But the more pieces, tiles you have in the mosaic, the better your decision is going to be, right? Our CEO, Martin McCarthy, always likes to say, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And, you know, that is absolutely true. There's, as you point out, such a paucity of information that anybody just providing a little bit of context and a little bit of analysis really does help fill out that mosaic.
And maybe let's try to tie it together and just get a little bit more of an insight about what clients get with your M&A knowledge base. I've mentioned the Outlook report, which obviously is this wonderful playbook. But I also know that you have this, this amazing online tool that allows people to interrogate your data. Can you give people just a bit of an overview of the sort of tools that investors are using to be able to make these decisions more confidently?
You know, absolutely. And this is a tool. It's a specialized tool aimed at the tech sector only. So by definition, it's got to be a lot different and a lot more insightful than generic M&A databases, of which there are many out there, right? And so how do we differentiate? So one thing is through taxonomy. We have a highly granular 650 categories. 625 wasn't enough, Duncan, so we needed 650 categories and subcategories of technology to help actually get some granularity. So when you're looking up a valuation comparable or something, you can get it with some precision. The other thing that's really, really important here is an insight into the rationale behind the transaction. So we're writing about a lot of these, or we're even writing about many sectors that have not consolidated yet. But the secret sauce, if you will, or the thing that our clients really value is that those proprietary estimates of a deal value or the trailing revenue, and sometimes earnings, but often there isn't earnings, right, of a transaction, because that does create that insight on the valuation. So Cisco just recently made an acquisition of a company in the networking space. They announced the deal value, but of course didn't announce the trailing revenue. We were pretty easily able to get a very well vetted number for that trailing revenue. And bingo, you have a 24x multiple on that transaction that you just really wouldn't have known about before because it wasn't disclosed. And so those are really the things that folks are getting. And of course, we have some new tools that let you visualize the data and report on it instantly almost, and create competitive intelligence reports you can send to your board or to your boss or even to your clients. And those are some new things we've just added to the database. And of course, I could talk a lot longer about the product, but I don't want to turn this into a commercial.
No, but I think that's useful because it gives an idea not only what's in the solution, but it also touches back on the way in which this data is being used. That I think now we're in the situation where every M&A process involves more. There are more stakeholders. There are more influencers. I think everyone who's running a tech firm complains about the way in which the buying center in the enterprise is larger now than it used to be. But goodness me, that is so much truer when it comes to the due diligence and valuation process that's involved in an entire tech company being bought by potential acquirers. You know, the need for data, the need for artifacts to support the decisions that people are considering. This seems to be becoming more profound, partly because of the way in which the market is just more cautious and anxious right now. As you say, that's largely because of macroeconomic trends. But I think surely the organizations that are best able to marshal a compelling case for their investments now are going to be the ones that will be able to make the best investments, to make the best progress, and be better positioned for when the market becomes more freely flowing in the future.
Exactly, and I think there's always going to be that push for risk reduction, but at the same time, I think a lot of the savviest acquirers are understanding you can't always pick the right ones, and they almost have a portfolio approach. And you know what? Out of the 10 companies we buy, 1 or 2 are going to be a complete hit, and 8 or 6 may be okay, and 2 will probably be dogs. But I think they're resigned to that, and they understand that. And all things being equal, the amount of money they're investing in these companies isn't that game-changing for them. So I think it's a little bit of both, but also just a recognition that not everything's going to be a big hit.
Well, I think that is quite an understatement. But I think a very good example of the stakes that organizations are playing with, and also the fact that so often when organizations are engaged in strategic M&A, even if they're making excellent bets, those bets still might pay off, but they still might fail. And that ambiguity, I think, is one more reason why organizations need the very best market intelligence that they need when they're looking for things that not only fit strategically, but are also going to convert into strong investments for their organizations.
Absolutely, and I still remember, this is probably dating myself really badly, but I was moderating a panel of investment bankers and corp dev folks way back when, and I asked about what was the best deal of the year, and that one they picked was AOL's acquisition of Time Warner, which proved to be one of the biggest debacles of any acquisition ever made. And so there's a lot of folks that get carried away in the heat of the moment, and despite all that analysis, I think some decisions still get made based on impulse or ego or just the need to get a big deal done. So those dogs are never going to go away, I'm afraid.
Okay, well, Tim, I think on that happy note, I think maybe we should draw the podcast to a close. Thank you so much for your time today. I wonder, do you have any final thoughts for our listeners, or if people want to know more about the M&A knowledge base, do you have any suggestions about what people can do to find out more?
Absolutely. I would say just send me an email directly. It's just couldn't be simpler. It's tim.miller@451research.com, and I'll make sure that you're very well taken care of in terms of information or a demo of our product, answering any questions you have. And I really appreciate this opportunity, Duncan. It was a lot of fun talking about this stuff because you don't get to sit back and think about the bigger picture very often.
Thank you. Well, it's always good to talk to you, Tim. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us on the Kea Research podcast. Visit www.kearesearch.com for more information on everything we talked about today, as well as free indispensable information on influencer relations and analyst value. Sign up for our newsletter and receive a free copy of our book, Influencer Relations: Insights on Analyst Value.